The air is thick with the damp, earthy scent of late summer and the distant, metallic tang of diesel fumes from the city's rush hour. Sunlight filters through the massive, triumphal arcade, casting long, distorted shadows across the paved lanes where young men in ill-fitting tweed jackets cycle past. The atmosphere in this capital of the nascent European economic community feels deceptively mild, almost peaceful, a velvet glove around the iron fist of the Cold War's political heart. But the tension is palpable if you know where to look. Every well-dressed diplomat hurrying toward a black Mercedes, every casually attired pedestrian lingering near a government building, carries an invisible weight, the East-West divide. Brussels is the epicenter of Western Europe's defense apparatus, the new home of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, headquarters, a massive, sterile complex that recently relocated from Paris. In a small, smoke-filled student cafe not far from the Avenue de Tervuren, Rainer Rupp is leaning back on a creaking wooden chair, watching the street. At 25, he possesses a sharp, inquisitive gaze and the kind of unassuming, slightly rumpled look that makes him blend effortlessly into the student population. He's here under a grant from the German Academic Exchange Service, DAD, officially studying economics at the University Libre de Bruxelles, ULB. Unofficially, he is a young man whose political beliefs have already hardened into a profound, almost zealous dedication to the socialist ideals of the German Democratic Republic, GDR, East Germany. Rainer adjusts the wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose and takes a slow sip of his strong, bitter coffee. He is not a revolutionary shouting slogans. He is a quiet observer, a reader of Marx and Lenin who sees the wealth and consumption of West Germany and the EEC with a mixture of contempt and intellectual certainty. To him, the West is decadent, fragile, and fundamentally unjust. His home, the GDR, represents the future. It is this unwavering faith that will soon become his most valuable and most dangerous asset. His focus is drawn to a copy of the Bundeswehr, West German Armed Forces, journal he's skimming. He's looking not just at the articles, but at the advertisements for defense contractors and job postings for economists and research assistants at various NATO offices. The sheer number of opportunities, the lax security visible even in the official hiring literature, is astounding to him. They're so careless, he mutters in German, folding the journal neatly. They truly believe their own propaganda of invincibility. The GDR's Ministry for State Security, or the Stasi, views the West's complacency not with contempt, but with professional opportunity. They have an entire foreign intelligence directorate, the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, HVA, dedicated to exploiting these weaknesses. The HVA is masterminded by the legendary and ruthlessly effective Marcus Wolf, a man known as the man without a face, because Western intelligence agencies, despite their resources, have no reliable photograph of him. Wolf's strategy is not to rely on flashy, Hollywood-style espionage. His genius lies in all-tag espionage, everyday espionage. He seeks out people like Rainer Rupp, ideologically committed, living legally in the West, and possessing the right professional skills to penetrate key institutions from the inside. A West German citizen from the Rhineland, Rainer is perfectly positioned. He has access to all Western travel and employment opportunities. He holds no suspicion. He is the perfect long-term sleeper. Later that afternoon, Rainer receives a cryptic message tucked into a book of poetry he checked out from the ULB library. A faint pencil marking on page 42, next to a poem about a journey home. It is a simple, prearranged signal. It tells him to proceed to a designated contact point outside of Bonn, back in West Germany, under the guise of visiting his family. He understands the implication immediately. His quiet dedication has been recognized. The ideological choice he made long ago is about to transform into a life-altering profession. He has been given an offer, not of money, but of purpose, to serve the cause from the heart of the enemy's camp. Rainer Rupp gathers his books, drops a few coins on the counter for the coffee, and walks out into the busy Brussels street. He is no longer just an economics student. He is a man with a hidden mission, and a massive, sprawling, complacent NATO headquarters awaits him just down the road. The most tempting, undefended target in the Western Alliance. October 1970. A safe house outside Bonn, West Germany. The journey back to the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, is uneventful, deliberately mundane. Rainer travels by train, carrying only a small briefcase and his student papers. He spends 2 days with his family in the Rhineland, carefully maintaining the facade of a visiting student worried about his upcoming exams. Then, under the cover of a lengthy study session with a former university colleague, he slips away. The safe house is a nondescript, post-war brick bungalow on the outskirts of Bonn, surrounded by thick, concealing pine trees. Inside, the atmosphere is professional, devoid of sentimentality. There are 3 men waiting for him, all from the HVA, the main directorate for reconnaissance. One is an older man, quiet and observant, who Rainer recognizes as his initial handler. The second is a younger man, sharp and meticulous, who will become his primary contact. The third is a specialist, a document forger and communications expert. The meeting is brief, intense, and entirely focused on preparation. There is no ideological lecture. The HVA assumes, correctly, that Rupp's commitment is already absolute. Their conversation is strictly operational, establishing his legend, his security protocols, and his mission parameters. Your name is Rainer Rupp. You are a West German citizen. Your politics are firmly center-left, perhaps a little skeptical of American power, but utterly loyal to the FRG. The older handler, a man named Gerd, instructs him, his voice low and gravelly. You will distance yourself subtly from the student groups you were active in. Your focus now is a career. The objective is clear. NATO, not a low-level clerk position, but something within the international staff, IS, the civilian core of the alliance, that involves strategic planning or economic analysis. The perfect entry point is the Economic Directorate, a sector considered vital but far less sensitive than intelligence or nuclear planning, making security checks less intrusive. Rainer is given his code name, a tradition in the HVA that provides psychological distance and security. From this day forward, Gerd states, sliding a new, clean passport in a small box across the table, you are Topaz. The box contains the tools of his new trade, microdots, chemical developers, and a state-of-the-art miniature Minix subminiature camera, a favored tool of espionage, capable of photographing thousands of pages of documents onto a single roll of film small enough to be concealed inside a pen or a cigarette lighter. The specialist patiently teaches Rupp the mechanics of using the Minix, how to adjust the aperture in low light, the technique for steady, quick shots of documents without leaving obvious creases or marks, and how to reload the film in absolute darkness. The learning is precise and immediate. Rupp practices on old copies of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung until the click of the shutter becomes a smooth, almost silent action. The most critical part of the training focuses on dead drops and radio traffic. He is given a dedicated shortwave receiver and taught how to decode the one-time pad, OTP, messages broadcast from East Berlin, which appear as endless, random number sequences on the airwaves. These messages will contain instructions, warnings, and exfiltration alerts. His replies will be less frequent, delivered via dead drops, hidden caches in public parks or along remote roads, filled with the exposed, undeveloped Minix film and written reports. The drop zones will rotate, always based on a prearranged calendar code. The communications expert explains, pointing to a complex grid. You miss 2 scheduled checks. We assume the worst, and the network activates a full stop. Do you understand the rules of the radio, Topaz? Rainer nods, his eyes intensely focused. Listen, do not transmit. Only receive the instructions. And never, under any circumstances, store the one-time pads in the same location as the receiver or the camera. The HVA men are drilling into him the fundamental rule of long-term infiltration. Paranoia is survival. Do not spend money you can't account for. Do not make unexplained trips. Do not cultivate habits. Become a ghost in the system. Before he leaves, Gerd offers a final piece of advice that would define the next decade of Topaz's life. They're arrogant, Rainer. The West German security services and the CIA are always looking for the KGB agents, the Eastern European military types. They are blind to the clerk, the economist, the German citizen with the slightly progressive viewpoint. That is your shield. Be boring. Be dependable. And remember what you are working for. Rupp returns to Brussels, the weight of the Minix camera and the knowledge of his mission replacing the weight of his textbooks. The next step is the most difficult, gaining entry into the formidable NATO headquarters. He begins his campaign immediately, applying for a research position within the Economic Directorate, tailoring his CV and his political narrative to the exact profile the HVA designed. The mockery the CIA and other Western agencies often directed at the East Germans, the belief that the Stasi were inept paper pushers, was already working to Rupp's advantage. They simply weren't looking for a man like Topaz. Late 1972, Boulevard Leopold III, Brussels, Belgium. The NATO headquarters is a sprawling complex of reinforced concrete and glass, a deliberate symbol of monolithic Western unity. For Rainer Rupp, now known as Topaz, the application process is a grueling exercise in professional theater. He's navigating a labyrinth of paperwork, interviews, and security questionnaires that would crush a less committed man. Crucially, as a West German citizen, his vetting is primarily handled by the Bundesnachrichtendienst (BND), West Germany's foreign intelligence service, which, focused on high-profile security threats, views an economics researcher as low priority. Rupp's HVA-crafted persona is flawless. He is ambitious, slightly critical of bureaucracy, and deeply interested in the economic stability of the alliance. The perfect candidate to assess the financial pressures exerted by the Warsaw Pact on Western Europe. His academic record is impeccable. His background checks reveal nothing untoward. His occasional left-leaning student activities are dismissed as youthful intellectual curiosity. In December 1972, Rupp receives the acceptance letter. He has been hired as a researcher in the Economic Directorate of the International Staff, IS. He has secured his pass, an official NATO security badge, granting him access to the civilian side of the fortress. His first days on the job are characterized by quiet observation. The headquarters, though heavily guarded externally, is internally a maze of bustling, careless confidence. The security culture is, ironically, the weakest link. Personnel from different nations treat their security clearances with varying degrees of respect. Documents are often left unattended on desks. Conversations about sensitive topics spill out into the hallways and cafeterias. This environment, where trust is implicitly given to those with the right badge, is exactly what Marcus Wolf had anticipated. Rupp quickly establishes a reputation as a diligent, detail-oriented economist. He is quiet, efficient, and never gossips, a valued trait in an environment rife with political maneuvering. He spends his days compiling reports on Soviet oil production, Eastern Bloc industrial capacity, and the financial burden of NATO's new weapon systems. This seemingly innocuous work gives him a legitimate need to handle large volumes of classified material and access various document storage facilities. The documents he accesses are categorized under NATO confidential and NATO secret. Even within the Economic Directorate, he sees analyses on the military budgets of member states, the cost of the deterrent, and projections on the economic impact of a potential conflict. Every relevant document, every piece of film he shoots with his Minix camera is a testament to the HVA's patience and his own ideological resolve. His espionage is conducted in brief, terrifying bursts of activity. He develops a routine for borrowing key files from the document rooms just before closing time, taking them into his locked office, and photographing them under the light of a small desk lamp. The click of the tiny shutter is the loudest sound in the world to him, a constant, sharp echo of the danger he is in. The film is immediately wrapped, sealed, and prepared for its journey east. The coordination with the HVA is a masterpiece of operational tradecraft. Twice a month, Rupp, or Topaz, executes a dead drop. He drives out of Brussels, often under the pretense of a weekend trip or visiting a distant colleague. The drop zones are chosen for their anonymity. A hollowed-out tree stump in the Ardennes forest, a loose brick in a disused wall near the German border, or a specific spot under a bridge in a minor Dutch town. He leaves the tiny canister of exposed film and retrieves the incoming instructions, usually a fresh one-time pad or specific tasking orders, which he decodes back in his apartment with his shortwave radio. The instructions he receives reflect the HVA's keen interest in Western political dynamics as much as military secrets. They want to know the mood of the alliance, the internal disagreements, the financial fault lines. They are building a psychological profile of the enemy. The intelligence Topaz is sending back is immediately valuable. By 1974, he is providing the Warsaw Pact with granular details on NATO's defense, spending, and logistics planning that allow the Eastern Bloc to refine their own strategic cost-benefit analysis. He is a keyhole through which the East can view the West's financial architecture. However, the real prize, the jewel in the crown that Marcus Wolf sought, lay in the heavily protected Defense Planning and Policy Directorate (DPP). This office dealt with the how of NATO's response, force structure, troop deployment, and, most critically, nuclear strategy. Rupp's current position grants him no direct access, but his dependability and growing reputation are opening doors. His superiors, impressed by his work, begin to introduce him to colleagues in more sensitive areas. They see him as a potential rising star, a man who, with a few more years of experience, could be promoted into a policy-making role. Topaz is playing the long game, establishing the trust that will grant him the access he needs to execute the HVA's ultimate mission. He is patient, knowing that in the closed, trusting environment of NATO, it is not brute force, but carefully cultivated relationships that will ultimately unlock the most guarded secrets. 1975 to 1976. NATO headquarters, Brussels. The mid-1970s marked a subtle, almost invisible shift in the Cold War landscape. The brief thaw of détente had made Western security services even more complacent, focusing their limited resources on known, high-risk KGB operations, while neglecting the long-term, ideological moles planted by the East German HVA. This environment was the fertile ground for Topaz. Rainer Rupp's professional life was a steady, upward climb defined by meticulous competence. He was promoted to a more senior position within the Economic Directorate, granting him better clearance and wider access to cross-directorate planning documents. He became known for his reliable, almost stoic demeanor. He cultivated a quiet, slightly cynical reputation, the kind of colleague who could be trusted not to leak internal disagreements, but who also wouldn't bother to report minor security infractions. This carefully constructed neutrality was his greatest operational defense. His espionage evolved from opportunistic document theft to systematic intelligence harvesting. He wasn't just photographing what was available. He was actively shaping his work assignments to gain access to specific data points requested by Marcus Wolf's team in East Berlin. For example, he requested to analyze the long-term economic impact of shifting tactical nuclear warheads from West German soil to other NATO member states. This legitimate research allowed him to pore over documents containing force dispersal data and command structures for nuclear assets. The crucial development came in early 1976. Rupp's director needed a liaison to coordinate economic analysis with a heavily fortified Defense Planning and Policy (DPP) division, the nerve center of military strategy. Rupp's detailed work on resource allocation made him the obvious choice. Rainer, your reports on the financial impact of the new Lantern system were exemplary. His German superior, Dr. Schneider, told him over lunch in the exclusive flag deck dining room. The DPP is constantly running hypotheticals. They need a sharp economist who understands the budgets. I want you to be our man on the ground over there. It's a temporary assignment, but it will look excellent on your file. The temporary assignment was the crack in the vault door. It granted Rupp a secondary, temporary security pass and a working space within the DPP building itself. This building was the core of NATO's military mind, containing the most sensitive materials, war plans, contingency operations, and the ultimate nuclear response protocols. This new posting necessitated a significant upgrade in his tradecraft. The DPP offices were far more restricted. Documents were handled by specialized couriers, and the document storage rooms, known internally as the vault, required multiple personnel to access the highest level classifications. Rupp now needed to engage in personal cultivation. He focused on the key individuals who could grant him incremental access. One was a British colonel, Ian McDowell, a genial, overworked planner with a habit of leaving his office late. Another was a young Danish stenographer, Ingrid, who controlled the sign-in and sign-out logs for certain classified reports. Rupp employed a subtle form of influence, sympathy and professional aid. He offered to stay late and help Colonel McDowell with complex economic projections for a simulated conflict scenario. He brought Ingrid strong, European-style coffee and offered to fix minor errors in her budget spreadsheets. He was unobtrusive, helpful, and above all, trustworthy. "It's a madhouse in here, Rainer," McDowell confessed one evening, running a tired hand over his face. "We're prepping the full force structure review for the ministerial meeting next month. Thousands of pages. I'll be here until midnight for weeks. Let me take a few of the non-military logistics appendices, Colonel," Rupp offered casually. "I can draft the executive summary on the economic overhead for the new reinforcement of the Central Region, Reforger strategy. It'll save you hours." This was how Topaz operated, using his legitimate role to place his hands on documents whose classified status was only secondary to his actual professional task. He wasn't stealing files, he was processing them. The documents, taken into his temporary, locked office in the late evening, were photographed rapidly using the silent, flash-free Minix camera, then returned before McDowell or any of the cleaning staff arrived. The intelligence pouring back to East Berlin was now of unprecedented quality. Wolf's HVA was receiving real-time data on NATO's defense posture, including details on the deployment timetables for U.S. forces crossing the Atlantic, the readiness levels of West German mechanized divisions, and the specific locations of command and control bunkers. Topaz was delivering the tactical blueprint of the Western Alliance, completely undetected, and his superiors in the HVA realized they had secured an intelligence asset of historic value. He was now operating at the highest echelons of Cold War espionage, completely insulated by the very system he was betraying. 1977 to 1978. The Defense Planning and Policy Directorate, DPP, NATO. By 1977, Rainer Rupp, operating as Topaz, was no longer a temporary liaison to the DPP. He was effectively a permanent, integrated fixture. His competence was seen as indispensable, his loyalty unquestioned. He had cultivated powerful relationships that served as inadvertent security buffers. Nobody questioned the presence of the reliable German economist working diligently late in the evening. The intelligence he was sending to East Berlin became increasingly focused, moving beyond logistics and budgets toward the ultimate secret, NATO's nuclear doctrine. Marcus Wolf and the HVA understood that knowing the conventional deployment schedules was valuable, but knowing the precise tripwire for nuclear escalation, the rules of engagement and the targets, was the key to strategic parity. They gave Topaz his most dangerous and most critical tasking yet. The target was the Single Integrated Operational Plan, SDOP, or in NATO parlance, the highly classified equivalent that detailed the exact steps the alliance would take from the moment a Soviet invasion was detected through the implementation of a first use of nuclear weapons, FUNW doctrine. This plan outlined everything: communication chains, the authorized launch codes, the yields of warheads, and the geographical targets within the Warsaw Pact. Accessing this material was exponentially more difficult than anything Topaz had done before. These documents were categorized as Cosmic Top Secret, CTS, or Atomal, requiring compartmentalized access, separate vaults, and constant, direct physical monitoring. They were never supposed to leave the dedicated storage facilities, and certainly not the headquarters. Topaz's strategy shifted from benign assistance to strategic positioning. He needed to be physically placed in a role that legitimately required him to interact with these plans. He managed this by volunteering to assist a small, high-level multinational working group responsible for modeling the economic and political fallout of a nuclear exchange in Central Europe. The group needed an economist, and Rupp, with his proven track record, was granted the necessary compartmentalized clearance. His office, now a small cubicle within the highly restricted DPP area, placed him within 50 feet of the primary CTS vault. The air in this corridor was perceptibly colder, the silence deeper. Every door required a numerical code and a key card. The critical weakness lay, as always, not in the technology, but in the human factor. The personnel managing the CTS documentation were either highly professional military officers focused solely on procedure, or low-ranking clerks who had grown dangerously numb to the magnitude of the material they handled. Rupp focused on a specific protocol weakness, the practice of working documents. For high-intensity, multi-day planning sessions, certain CTS reports were permitted to be temporarily withdrawn from the vault and placed in a secured briefing room for authorized officers. Crucially, the clerks often lacked the security training or the rank to challenge a senior member of the modeling group who claimed to need a document for a quick, private cross-reference. One late Tuesday evening, during a lull in a critical simulation exercise, Rupp saw his opportunity. A massive, thick, binder-marked cosmic top secret, the European Deterrent Initiative EDI, Annex B, Escalation Pathways, was left unattended on the desk of a sleepy American colonel. The colonel had stepped out for a mandated security break, believing his colleagues were still in the room. Rupp acted instantly, his heart hammering against his ribs, yet his movements were measured and professional. He grabbed the binder, walked the 10 paces to his own locked cubicle, and pulled out his Minix. He couldn't risk the light of his lamp. He had to work purely by the faint spill of the hallway lights and the sheer adrenaline coursing through him. He photographed the core 50 pages of Annex B, the documents detailing the precise trigger points and the initial conventional to nuclear transition scenarios. The process took less than 4 minutes. He shot the photos at high speed, careful not to damage the binding or leave crease marks. The binder was then quietly replaced on the colonel's desk seconds before the officer returned. The exposed film, an incredibly dense reel of strategic secrets, was immediately sealed into a small compartment he had carefully fashioned into the heel of one of his dress shoes. The next morning, Topaz made his scheduled dead drop, the contents of which would shake the very foundations of the Western defense strategy. The HVA's reception of this film was ecstatic. Marcus Wolf now possessed the key Western nuclear response scenarios, giving the Warsaw Pact an unprecedented strategic advantage. They knew exactly how far they could push NATO conventionally before risking nuclear retaliation, and where the most sensitive command centers were located. The mockery of the inept East German spies was about to be obliterated by the success of Topaz. Early 1978. East Berlin, GDR. HVA headquarters. The canister containing the film shot by Topaz was handled with extraordinary care by the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, HVA's technical laboratory in East Berlin. The development process itself was a top priority, high-security operation. When the film was finally enlarged and the images of the Cosmic Top Secret, CTS, documents appeared clearly on the projection screen, the room, filled with senior analysts and military strategists, fell into stunned silence. Marcus Wolf, the legendary head of the HVA, stood at the back, his expression characteristically unreadable. What Rainer Rupp, Topaz, had delivered was not merely a set of classified reports, but the strategic core of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO's deterrent posture. The flexible response doctrine broken down to its most sensitive, actionable detail. The documents, specifically the European Deterrent Initiative, EDI, Annex B, revealed the detailed trigger points for nuclear escalation. They outlined the concept of demonstration strikes designed to signal resolve, the specific Western European targets that NATO command had pre-selected for early nuclear use, and, critically, the red lines, The specific conventional force incursions by the Warsaw Pact that NATO analysts had determined would mandate a nuclear response. The value of this intelligence was incalculable. "We have the nuclear playbook," declared Colonel General Fritz Kohler, the HVA deputy director, his voice low with professional awe. "For 10 years, the West has relied on the ambiguity of the nuclear umbrella to deter us. Now, the ambiguity is gone. We know the rules of their game." For the Warsaw Pact High Command, this intelligence was transformative. It allowed them to completely overhaul their military strategy. They could now design conventional warfare scenarios that would achieve deep territorial gains in West Germany and potentially seize strategic targets, like the Fulda Gap, without tripping the nuclear escalation protocols revealed by Topaz. They knew exactly which targets NATO prioritized and which they were prepared to sacrifice in the initial exchange, allowing them to reposition their own forces accordingly. Wolf's primary concern, however, was not the military application, but the security of his asset. Topaz had performed a miracle, but he was now working with documents so sensitive that a single leak could lead to a massive counterintelligence hunt. "He is to be handled with extreme caution," Wolf dictated to the communications handler. "Tasking for Topaz must cease immediately on any CTS documents. We have enough to rewrite the strategic map. From now on, his mission is survival and the maintenance of his cover. We will transition him to gathering lower-level political intelligence, something boring, something easy to explain if he is ever questioned." The HVA responded with extreme financial care as well. Rupp was ideologically driven and had never asked for money, but the HVA understood the risks he was taking. They arranged for periodic, untraceable deposits into a numbered Swiss bank account and an account in the FRG, managing the money meticulously to ensure no sudden increase in wealth would raise suspicion from the BND, West German intelligence, or the LK, criminal police. The pressure on Rainer Rupp in Brussels, though less acute from a tasking perspective, was internal and psychological. He knew the immense value of what he had delivered. He had spent 4 minutes holding the peace of the world in his hands, and the adrenaline of that moment never fully dissipated. He returned to the familiar rhythm of the economic directorate, writing reports on steel production and energy consumption, deliberately making his work less exciting, less high-profile. He maintained his carefully constructed persona, the dependable, slightly overworked German economist who rarely took long vacations. Unbeknownst to Topaz, the intelligence he provided was already being put to direct, real-world use. In high-level Soviet Warsaw Pact war games conducted in 1978 and 1979, the Eastern Bloc armies were demonstrating unprecedented success in maneuvering against hypothetical NATO defenses, success directly attributable to the intimate knowledge of NATO's response times and tripwires provided by Topaz. The CIA and the BND, observing these war game successes, simply scratched their heads. They attributed the improvement to better Soviet technology or enhanced training. They never suspected that the source of the Soviet advantage was not a satellite or an electronic eavesdropping program, but a quiet, ordinary economist working in the heart of their Brussels headquarters. The arrogance and institutional blindness that Marcus Wolf had counted on had delivered the ultimate strategic victory, completely undetected. 1978 to 1984. The NATO International Staff, Brussels. The years following the delivery of the nuclear plans saw Rainer Rupp's life settle into a pattern of dangerous, high-stakes monotony. He was the ghost in the machine, the ultimate insider who had become so familiar, so dependable, that he was simply part of the furniture at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO headquarters. This decade of continuous, undetected operation elevated Topaz from a successful mole to a legendary intelligence asset within the HVA. His professional career continued to advance on merit. He was promoted within the Economic Directorate, becoming a respected principal administrator. This new level of authority was the final piece of Marcus Wolf's long-term plan. Topaz was now a policy insider, not just a researcher. He attended senior-level staff meetings, drafted position papers for the Secretary General, and contributed to high-profile planning sessions on the economic ramifications of the arms race, including the controversial deployment of Pershing II and Griffin cruise missiles. Rupp's intelligence output during this period shifted dramatically, following the HVA's strict security protocol. He ceased attempting to access cosmic top-secret material. Instead, he focused on lower-level, but still crucial, NATO secret and confidential reports concerning political negotiations, economic vulnerabilities within the alliance, and internal friction between member states, particularly the often strained relationship between the United States and its European partners. This provided the Warsaw Pact with invaluable political intelligence, enabling them to target their propaganda and diplomatic efforts with surgical precision. His espionage routine was a testament to his discipline. The Minix camera was used sparingly, primarily to document sensitive meeting notes or political briefing papers. Most of his intelligence was now transmitted as highly detailed, well-written analysis, often synthesizing multiple documents that he read legitimately as part of his job. This method was safer, relying on his prodigious memory and professional access, rather than the risky act of theft and photography. The dead drops continued with clockwork regularity, maintaining the illusion of continuity and preventing the HVA from assuming the worst. Rupp would drive hundreds of kilometers to the carefully selected drop points, sometimes utilizing the cover of legitimate professional travel to an international conference in Luxembourg or The Hague. He was a master of his legend, capable of discussing European economic policy one minute and executing a flawless dead drop the next. The danger of this routine was the sheer length of the deception. Over 10 years, the risks multiplied exponentially. Every colleague, every lover, every new security guard at the gate was a potential point of failure. Rupp married in the early 1980s. The marriage, to a woman completely unconnected to the military or intelligence worlds, served as yet another layer of normalcy and protection. A happily married man with a stable job at the core of Western defense was the very image of reliability, the last person anyone would suspect of being a deep cover mole for the GDR. During this time, the Western counterintelligence community, specifically the CIA and the Sûreté de l'État, Belgian state security, were actively hunting for deep cover moles, but their focus remained fixed on traditional targets: KGB officers operating out of diplomatic missions or Eastern Europeans recruited through blackmail. They were convinced that any spy capable of penetrating NATO to this level would be a highly trained foreign national using an elaborate false identity. The possibility of a loyal West German citizen, an economist, an insider with the correct background and papers, was simply not in their psychological profile of a traitor. The prevailing joke among CIA officers stationed in Brussels was the supposed incompetence of the Stasi and the HVA. They were seen as clumsy, overly bureaucratic, and reliant on outdated methods. This institutional arrogance was Topaz's ultimate shield. While Western intelligence chased phantom Russian diplomats, Rainer Rupp sat in a secured office, drafting reports on the future of European defense, knowing that the most critical secrets had already been funneled to East Berlin years ago, fundamentally altering the global balance of power. He was a man living two parallel lives: the respectable European functionary in the glass towers of NATO, and the dedicated ideological soldier whose unseen work provided the Warsaw Pact with a near-perfect understanding of their adversary. For the HVA, Topaz was more than a spy. He was a strategic window, kept open year after year by a man who had become an invisible, yet indispensable, fixture of the Western Alliance. 1985 to 1988. NATO headquarters in the shadow of defection. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War was entering its final, unpredictable phase. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union brought new rhetoric of openness, but also a renewed and intense paranoia from Western intelligence services who feared a Soviet Trojan horse. This period coincided with a series of high-profile security failures that began to shake the confidence of the CIA and the FBI. Topaz, still operating flawlessly within NATO, was now one of the longest-running, highest-placed moles in the history of Cold War espionage. He was privy to discussions regarding NATO's political response to the burgeoning reform movements in the Eastern Bloc and Gorbachev's diplomatic initiatives. The intelligence he provided now focused on political fault lines, which Western governments were willing to negotiate, which were hardliners, and what was the absolute bottom line for the West in terms of disarmament treaties. However, the shadow of suspicion, long dormant, began to stretch across the intelligence landscape. The catalyst was not Topaz himself, but the increasing number of high-level defections from the East. The key turning point occurred in 1985 with the defection of Vitaly Yurchenko, a senior KGB officer. While Yurchenko did not specifically mention the East German HVA's operations, his defection initiated a massive, cross-agency review of all classified breaches across NATO and the U.S. government. The review highlighted a consistent, recurring pattern. The Warsaw Pact seemed to possess an almost psychic understanding of NATO's negotiation strategies and military readiness levels. Simultaneously, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, and the Verfassungsschutz, German domestic intelligence, began to seriously re-examine a number of cases of missing personnel files and classified military reports from the late 1970s that had been previously dismissed as administrative errors. The BND initiated Operation Kreis Circle, a discrete internal audit designed to identify any West German citizen working in a sensitive NATO position who had any unusual ideological background, financial anomaly, or unexplained foreign travel. They were looking for the classic KGB illegals or low-level clerks coerced into spying. Rainer Rupp's carefully constructed legend continued to hold. His ideological background was noted as only mildly left-leaning from his student days. His finances were stable, managed by the HVA to appear entirely legitimate. His travel was always accounted for by either family visits or professional NATO duties. Yet, as the net widened, the security climate tightened perceptibly inside the Brussels headquarters. New rules were implemented. More frequent desk sweeps, stricter sign-in/sign-out procedures for classified binders, and a mandated use of locked security bags for all documents taken outside secure rooms. For Topaz, this meant a necessary reduction in activity, but it also confirmed the HVA's wisdom in pulling him back from high-value military targets years earlier. He focused on maintaining his cover, performing his legitimate duties with heightened visibility, and ensuring his dead drops were carried out with tripled caution. He learned to identify the faces of new security personnel and developed an acute awareness of every new camera angle and movement detector in the building. The internal pressure on Rupp was immense. The knowledge that he was the ghost the entire Western intelligence apparatus was hunting was a constant internal scream. He knew the cost of failure. Not just life imprisonment, but the strategic damage his capture could inflict on the HVA's entire network. The ultimate breakthrough for Western intelligence came not from the BND's careful audit, but from a catastrophic internal collapse within the HVA itself. In 1988, a high-ranking officer of the HVA, Werner Stiller, who had served as a double agent for the BND before defecting, provided a list of dozens of HVA targets and operational details. Though Stiller had no direct knowledge of Topaz, Rupp was too highly compartmentalized. His defection gave Western agencies an unprecedented window into the structure and philosophy of HVA espionage, specifically the emphasis on deep cover, ideologically motivated German nationals. Stiller's intelligence didn't name Topaz, but it revealed the type of spy the HVA was prioritizing, the sleeper who achieved seniority. This changed the rules of Operation Kreis. The BND stopped looking for the stereotypical foreign agent and started looking at their own citizens in key NATO posts, leading them to a very short list of individuals whose professional access did not fully match their low-level political vetting from over a decade prior. Rainer Rupp's file was about to be pulled from the bottom of the pile. The implosion of the GDR and Topaz's final tasking. The year 1989 was one of cascading, revolutionary change. For Rainer Rupp, operating as Topaz inside NATO, it meant the slow, agonizing collapse of the political system he had dedicated his life to serving. As the Hungarian border fence was breached and massive protests erupted in Leipzig and East Berlin, the focus of the HVA shifted from intelligence gathering to the desperate survival of its network. In the early months of 1989, the communications from East Berlin via the shortwave radio grew increasingly sparse and frantic. The messages were no longer tasks, they were warnings. Markus Wolf, long since retired but still influential, had ensured that the HVA had meticulous plans for asset exfiltration in the event of a political collapse. The primary goal of the HVA now was Operation Settle, the complete, secure withdrawal of all deep cover agents, the destruction of all evidence connecting them to East Berlin, and the maintenance of their cover should the GDR fail. The HVA wanted its agents to be untraceable, capable of living out their lives with their false identities intact, in case the socialist project could ever be revived. Rainer Rupp received his final, most critical operational tasking in July 1989. It was a detailed, three-part message delivered through his coded radio frequency, using a new, more complex one-time pad, OTP. Destruction Protocol. Immediately and permanently dispose of the Minix camera, all remaining OTP sheets, the shortwave receiver, and all documents or personal effects that could connect him to the GDR or the HVA. This had to be done in a way that left no residual forensic evidence, e.g., using chemical solvents, deep-sea disposal. Cover maintenance. Sever all connections with the prearranged dead drop system. Cease all contact. Maintain his professional role at NATO, but become politically passive. If questioned by security services, his story must be simple. A long-serving, non-political German official. Contingency funds. Access the emergency contingency funds established in his Swiss account. Use a portion to establish a robust, untraceable West German financial profile that could withstand scrutiny from the BND for years. The execution of the destruction protocol was a terrifying nighttime operation. Rupp drove to the coast of the Netherlands, securing the Minix camera and the communications gear inside a lead-weighted box. He tossed the box far out into the icy waters of the North Sea, watching the dark waves swallow the tools of his trade. He chemically destroyed the last remaining OTPs and coded message paper, meticulously dissolving them in acid until they were sludge, which he then disposed of in the public sewage system. Back in Brussels, he spent weeks ensuring his office and apartment were surgically clean, removing every trace of his parallel life. The weight of his mission, once a source of strength, was now a dangerous liability. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. For the vast majority of the world, it was a moment of euphoria and liberation. For Rainer Rupp, it was the sound of his entire world structure imploding. He watched the televised scenes of jubilant East Berliners flooding across the checkpoint from his apartment in Brussels, feeling a profound, lonely sense of dread. His social estate was gone. His ideological mission had vaporized. He was left with nothing but his cover identity and the monumental secret of his decade-long betrayal. Inside NATO, the atmosphere was one of bewildered triumph. Colleagues celebrated the victory of the West and the end of the Cold War threat. Rupp had to participate in the celebration, offering quiet, professional congratulations, while internally calculating the survival chances of a secret. The collapse of the GDR had an immediate and catastrophic effect on the HVA. The files, the heart of the agency, were haphazardly destroyed or seized. Crucially, in the chaos following the initial breach of the Stasi headquarters, thousands of files were saved or stolen by defecting officers and concerned citizens. These files, now in the hands of the newly formed Gauck Authority, responsible for Stasi record inspection, held the key to the entire Topaz operation. Rainer Rupp's name was not on the files, but his unique code name, Topaz, was. The file contained detailed reports on the spectacular intelligence delivered in 1978, explicitly mentioning a mole in the NATO Economic Directorate with a specific professional background. The BND, now merging its intelligence with the wealth of Stasi files, finally had the pieces of the puzzle. The long, frustrating hunt for the phantom spy who had stolen the nuclear plan was about to end, not with brilliant counterespionage, but with the implosion of the Eastern Bloc itself. 1990 to 1992. Bonn, Germany. The Gauck Authority and the BND headquarters. The massive, chaotic task of processing the Stasi and HVA files began in earnest in the newly reunited Germany. It was a Herculean effort undertaken by the Gauck Authority, tasked with making sense of the East German state's machinery of repression. Amidst the thousands of files detailing surveillance and political imprisonment, a dedicated team of counterintelligence analysts from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, were focused on the Foreign Intelligence Directorate, the HVA. The discovery of the file labeled Topaz, NATO sent immediate shockwaves through the BND leadership. While the file did not contain the agent's true name, it was a comprehensive operational history, detailing the mole's penetration of the NATO headquarters and the specific type of intelligence he provided. The analysts were stunned by the sheer quality and duration of the espionage. The file confirmed that the HVA had received cosmic top-secret material, including NATO's nuclear response strategy, in the late 1970s. The BND immediately cross-referenced the file details against their existing, highly restricted suspect list from Operation Kreis. The description was chillingly specific. A German national with a West German passport, employed in a senior role within the NATO International Staff, IS, specifically the Economic Directorate. Long tenure, starting in the early 1970s. Background in economics with mildly left-leaning student politics. This description reduced the list of potential suspects to a handful of individuals. Rainer Rupp's file, previously buried in low-priority archives, now shot to the top. His profile matched the HVA's ideal Kundschafter des Friedens, peace scout, an ideologically committed, integrated insider. A joint BND and CIA task force was immediately formed, operating in complete secrecy. Their focus was no longer on catching a spy in the act, but on gathering irrefutable proof to prosecute a high-level official without compromising intelligence sources, a task made easier by the HVA's own meticulous record-keeping. The surveillance on Rupp began discreetly in early 1991. Under the pretense of standard NATO file review, BND agents working undercover within the Brussels headquarters began examining his professional history, his personal movements, and his financial records. They found nothing immediately incriminating. Rupp's life was still a portrait of professional diligence and middle-class stability. He was still the quiet, dependable economist. The breakthrough came from examining the financial trails revealed in the HVA documents. The files indicated the existence of the carefully managed Swiss and West German accounts used to fund Topaz. Using warrants obtained from the newly unified German judicial system, the BND was able to trace the periodic, untraceable deposits into a specific numbered account. The deposits, initiated by shell companies traced back to the GDR's foreign trade offices, were clearly linked to the operational funding of an HVA asset. The final piece of evidence was securing the identity of the HVA handler for Topaz. In the confusion of the Stasi collapse, another minor HVA officer defected and confirmed that Rainer Rupp was indeed the operative code-named Topaz. This confirmation closed the loop between the operational history, the profile, the financial trail, and the real name. For Rupp, the silence from his former masters in the East was confirmation that his espionage life was over. He believed his meticulous adherence to the destruction protocol in 1989 had secured his future. He continued working at NATO, even taking on new responsibilities related to post-Cold War transition policies, ironically helping NATO dismantle the very threat he had secretly aided for 2 decades. He felt safe. The ideological conflict was over. The security apparatus was focused on cleaning up the pieces. He never suspected that the same bureaucratic meticulousness that defined the East German state, the very trait he admired, was now leading the BND directly to his door. He had successfully evaded the combined efforts of the CIA, BND, and Belgian security for 16 years, but he could not evade the paper trail left behind by his own organization's collapse. The clock was ticking toward his final arrest. July 2, 1993. The Federal Republic of Germany, FRG. The investigation into Rainer Rupp, code-named Topaz, had reached its inevitable conclusion. The Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, in close coordination with federal prosecutors, decided to execute the arrest on German soil, where they had primary jurisdiction and where the evidence linking him to the defunct GDR state was strongest. They waited for Rupp to take his annual leave, ensuring the arrest would occur away from the secure, politically sensitive environment of the NATO headquarters in Brussels. July 2, 1993. Rupp was visiting family in the Rhineland, the same region where he had first been recruited by the HVA over 2 decades prior. He was driving his modest family car, navigating a quiet, tree-lined street near his parents' home, when a plain, dark sedan suddenly pulled in front of him, forcing him to brake hard. Almost instantly, 2 more unmarked vehicles boxed him in from the sides and rear. Before he could process this sudden, aggressive maneuver, 5 men in civilian clothes, clearly trained professionals, were surrounding his car. One of them, a BND officer, tapped sharply on the window. Rupp, the master of composure, did not panic instantly. He rolled down the window, his expression a mixture of confusion and mild annoyance, ready to deliver a polite, West German complaint about reckless driving. "Mr. Rupp," the lead officer said, his voice calm and authoritative, holding up a federal identification card. "We are officers of the BND. You're under arrest on suspicion of treason and espionage against the Federal Republic of Germany and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization." The word treason, Landesverrat, hit Rupp with the force of a physical blow. In that single, final moment, the reality of his 2 parallel lives snapped together. The years of planning, the cold calculation, the success, all evaporated. He realized that the collapse of the wall had not saved him. It had simply delayed the inevitable discovery. He had been so focused on external threats that he failed to account for the internal collapse of his own state. Rupp offered no resistance. He was professionally trained for this moment, taught that denial and silence were the only options. He was removed from his car, calmly but firmly placed in handcuffs, and transported immediately to a secure detention facility in Karlsruhe. The subsequent search of his apartment in Brussels, conducted under an expedited international warrant, yielded no immediate physical evidence, a testament to his meticulous execution of the destruction protocol in 1989. The Minix camera, the radio, and the codes were all gone, deep under the North Sea. However, the BND's case was not dependent on finding the physical tools of his trade. Their evidence was built on the HVA's own records, now officially processed by the Gauck Authority. The Topaz operational file detailing the specific intelligence delivered, including the dates and targets, e.g., the 1978 theft of the CTS nuclear plans. The professional profile of Rainer Rupp perfectly matching the specifications in the file. The undisputed trace of the HVA contingency funds into his private financial accounts. The testimony of the defecting HVA officer who identified Topaz as Rupp. The news of the arrest was a classified earthquake in the intelligence community. The man they had laughed at, the supposed product of a clumsy, inefficient intelligence service, had been inside the NATO headquarters for over 16 years. He had held a key to the Western world's most protected secret, the nuclear response plan, and had successfully passed it to the opposition, completely changing the strategic calculus of the Cold War without ever being spotted. The mockery that the CIA and BND had directed at the Stasi had come back to humiliate them on an unprecedented scale. The magnitude of the information compromised by Topaz was now laid bare. Intelligence analysts immediately began reviewing all NATO war games and Soviet maneuvers from the late 1970s and 1980s, realizing that the Eastern Bloc's consistent ability to counter Western strategy was not luck, but direct, real-time knowledge. In his interrogation room, Rainer Rupp maintained his silence, initially adhering to the HVA's training. But when confronted with the sheer volume of his own organization's paper trail, the detailed reports he himself had written years ago in East Berlin, his defense crumbled. He realized his life had been documented not by the enemy, but by his own side. The meticulous bureaucracy of the East German state had ultimately been his undoing. 1993 to 1994. The Federal High Court, Karlsruhe, Germany. The trial of Rainer Rupp, code named Topaz, in the Federal High Court of Germany was one of the most secretive and consequential legal proceedings of the post-Cold War era. While many details were, and remain, classified, the public revelation that a mole had operated undetected inside NATO for nearly 2 decades and had compromised the alliance's most guarded secrets rocked the foundations of Western intelligence. Rupp, facing charges of treason and aggravated espionage, eventually broke his silence. He admitted his identity as Topaz and confirmed the critical details of his espionage, framing his actions not as greed-driven betrayal, but as a deep-seated ideological commitment to the socialist ideals of the GDR. He provided the court with a clear, calm account of his recruitment, his slow-burn infiltration, and the meticulous tradecraft that allowed him to rise through the ranks of the NATO international staff. The most damaging testimony, however, concerned the single integrated operational plan, SJOP, the nuclear response doctrine he had photographed in 1978. NATO analysts, working through the trial's evidence, finally quantified the strategic cost of his actions. The information had given the Warsaw Pact a catastrophic advantage. Decoy strategy. Knowing the nuclear tripwires allowed Soviet planners to design conventional offensives that would push NATO to the brink without triggering the most severe nuclear retaliation thresholds. Target hardening. The East was able to significantly reinforce and relocate key military and political targets identified in NATO's targeting annexes, rendering entire portions of the Western Plan obsolete before it could ever be executed. Political insight. Rupp's later intelligence on the internal political divisions within NATO allowed the Soviet Union to drive wedges between allies, knowing precisely where the weakest links in the alliance's resolve lay. The sheer volume and strategic depth of the material compromised by Topaz made his case unique. He was categorized not merely as a thief of secrets, but as a major strategic asset whose long-term efforts fundamentally altered the Cold War balance of power in Central Europe. The mockery the CIA and BND had once directed at the Stasi was now a source of deep institutional embarrassment. They had been looking for flashy spies when the real threat was the quiet, trustworthy colleague in the cubicle next door. On February 25, 1994, Rainer Rupp was convicted on all counts of treason and espionage. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The court noted the severity of the intelligence past, offset slightly by the fact that he was ideologically, not financially, motivated. The aftermath of the Topaz case triggered immediate, drastic overhauls in security protocol across the entire NATO alliance. Agencies recognized the failure of relying solely on vetting initial security clearance and shifted focus to continuous, intrusive monitoring of high-level personnel. The age of the ideological sleeper, the deep-cover mole who earned his way to the top, was over. The Topaz case ensured that Western intelligence would never again view the HVA as merely a collection of bumbling East German bureaucrats. Rainer Rupp was released from prison in 2000, having served his full term. He re-entered a unified Germany that bore no resemblance to the ideological battlefield he had left. The socialist state he had risked his life for was gone. The Warsaw Pact dissolved, and NATO was rapidly expanding eastward, encompassing his former enemies. He remains unrepentant about his actions, arguing that his role was to gather information for the defense of the GDR, not to cause harm. He views himself as a patriot of a defunct state, a dedicated intelligence officer who simply served his country in a long, ideological war. The story of Topaz is the definitive illustration of the strategic genius of Marcus Wolf and the ultimate failure of Western complacency. A single, dedicated man, armed with little more than a tiny camera and an unshakable conviction, infiltrated the West's most guarded military fortress, stole its nuclear response plan, and operated for 16 years as the most successful and destructive mole of the late Cold War. He proved that sometimes the greatest threats don't come through the front door with a fake name, but are delivered by the trusted colleague with a familiar face.